It was a Tuesday evening in March when I first saw the listing. I'd been hunting for vintage furniture to fill my new apartment, and the Victorian mirror caught my attention immediately. Ornate silver frame, only $60 seemed too good to be true. I messaged the seller, Margaret, and arranged to pick it up. She lived in Maple Heights, one of those older neighborhoods where mature oak trees blocked out most of the streetlight. When I knocked, it took forever for her to answer, and when she did, I understood why the mirror was so cheap. She was probably 70, frail, with cloudy eyes and shaking hands. But what struck me most was how desperate she seemed to get rid of it. "It's in the basement," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, just take it, tonight." The basement was cramped and musty, but the mirror was beautiful. Even under harsh fluorescent lights, I could see the real silver frame and remarkably clear glass. When I asked how long she'd had it, her hands clenched. Too long, much too long. I should have asked more questions. Instead, I paid $60 and drove home feeling like I'd won the lottery. The mirror looked perfect in my bedroom, mounted opposite my bed. For the first week, I couldn't have been happier. Then I started noticing things. My sleep became restless. I'd wake up multiple times each night with the persistent feeling that something was wrong. After a few nights, I realized what was bothering me every time I woke up. I had the distinct impression that I'd been staring at the mirror in my sleep, not glancing, but studying my own reflection for hours. Then I started finding myself standing in front of it. The first time, I woke up at 3 a.m., barefoot on cold hardwood, staring at my reflection. My image looked back with an expression I didn't remember, making something between confusion and fear. I stumbled back to bed and tried to forget, but it kept happening. The second time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection, I could see my bed clearly rumpled sheets, the impression where my body had been. But the person in the mirror wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the bed, studying it, memorizing it. I tried covering the mirror with a sheet, but I'd wake to find it removed, folded neatly on my dresser. I moved it to the living room, but somehow it was always back in my bedroom by morning. I started wondering if I was having a breakdown. Then I found the photographs. Going through my phone one morning, I discovered dozens of pictures I hadn't taken, all of the mirror, shot from different angles, different times. What disturbed me most were the ones taken in complete darkness. The mirror was clearly visible, generating its own pale, silvery glow, and in every single photo, my reflection was looking directly at the camera. I tried calling Margaret, but her number was disconnected. I drove to her house and found it empty with a for sale sign. Neighbors said she'd moved suddenly, in the middle of the night, leaving everything behind. That's when I knew I had to get rid of it. I listed it on Craigslist using Margaret's exact description and price. Within hours, I had interested buyers. But every time someone came to look at it, they'd change their mind. They'd stand in front of it, their expression slowly shifting from interest to discomfort to fear, then make excuses and leave. Finally, a young woman named Sarah agreed to take it. She had the same eager excitement I'd felt, admiring the craftsmanship, calling it a steal at $60. I helped her load it into her car, and as I watched her drive away, I felt relief mixed with guilt that I still can't shake. Because I knew somewhere deep in my bones that in a few weeks, Sarah would be standing in her bedroom at 3 a.m, staring at her own reflection and wondering when she'd lost control of her life. The mirror finds its way to people who need to see themselves clearly, but sometimes, clarity is the last thing you want. Sometimes, the truth about who you really are, about what you're capable of in the dark hours when no one's watching, is too terrible to bear. I sleep better now, but I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night. And when I do, I'm grateful that the only reflection I face is in my bathroom mirror, the one that only shows me what I choose to see, not what's really there.
After the radio, I swore off Craigslist entirely, but grief has a way of making you do stupid things, and 3 months after my father's funeral, I found myself scrolling through listings again, looking for anything that might fill the emptiness he'd left behind. My dad had been a writer, never published, but he'd spent every evening at his old Remington typewriter, working on stories that he claimed would someday make him famous. When he died, my stepmother threw out all his manuscripts along with the typewriter, saying they were just taking up space. So when I saw the listing for a 1960s Remington quietwriter, the exact same model, I didn't hesitate. The seller wanted $50, and I would have paid 10 times that for the chance to feel connected to my father again. The seller was a woman named Carol who lived in Riverside Heights. In one of those ranch-style houses that all looked identical, she met me at the door with the typewriter already boxed up like she couldn't wait to get rid of it. "Belonged to my late husband," she said, avoiding eye contact. "He was a writer. Well, tried to be." The typewriter was in perfect condition, clean keys, smooth carriage return, even a fresh ribbon. I tested a few letters on a scrap of paper, and the familiar sound brought tears to my eyes. It sounded exactly like my father's. Did your husband did he ever write anything on it?" I asked. Carol's face darkened. Oh yes, he wrote plenty. Too much, if you ask me. I didn't understand what she meant until I got the typewriter home and started using it. At first, everything seemed normal. I'd sit down in the evenings and type nothing serious, just journal entries about my day, letters to friends, random thoughts. The familiar rhythm of the keys was therapeutic, and for the first time since Dad's death, I felt some semblance of peace. But after about a week, I started noticing something strange. Sometimes, when I'd sit down to write, words would appear on the page that I didn't remember typing. At first I assumed it was just muscle memory, my fingers finding familiar phrases while my mind wandered. Then the words started forming complete sentences, complete thoughts that weren't mine. "The rain tonight reminds me of the night she left," appeared on a page where I'd been writing about weekend plans. I should have told her the truth before it was too late. Showed up in the middle of a grocery list. "The basement is where I keep the important things," materialized while I was typing a work email. I started paying closer attention, and I realized the typewriter was adding these sentences. When I paused to think, during those brief moments when my hands rested on the keys, something else was guiding my fingers. The messages became more frequent and more disturbing. Stories about a woman named Helen who'd left her husband 20 years ago. Details about arguments, about threats, about a man's growing obsession with a wife who no longer loved him. I tried researching Carol's husband and found an obituary from 2 years ago. David Morrison, survived by his wife Carol and estranged daughter Helen. The obituary mentioned his lifelong passion for writing, and requested donations to a domestic violence shelter in lieu of flowers. That detailed the domestic violence shelter made my stomach turn. The typewriter's messages became more specific, more confessional. "Helen called today, but hung up when I answered. Found her new address. She lives in Portland now. She thinks the restraining order will protect her. I know where she works." I wanted to stop reading, but I couldn't. Each night I'd sit down intending to write something normal, and instead find myself transcribing David Morrison's obsessions, his plans, his darkest thoughts about the woman who'd escaped him. The worst part was how reasonable he made it all sound, how he justified every violation of her privacy, every attempt to track her down, every threat disguised as love. By the end of each session, I found myself almost sympathetic to his perspective. That's when I realized what the typewriter was really doing. It wasn't just replaying David's thoughts, it was trying to make me understand them, accept them, maybe even act on them. I started researching Helen Morrison and found her LinkedIn profile. She was a social worker in Portland, just like the typewriter had said. She looked happy in her photo, confident, free. Everything her father had tried to prevent her from becoming. The typewriter wanted me to contact her. I could feel it pulling at my thoughts, suggesting that she needed to know the truth about her father's feelings, that she owed him something, that she'd abandoned a man who'd only ever loved her. I lasted one more night before I couldn't take it anymore. I found Carol's number and called her. "You have to take it back," I said. "The typewriter, I can't keep it." "What has it been telling you?" she asked quietly. "You know what it's been telling me." There was a long pause. "David used that thing every night for 20 years, typing letters to Helen that he never sent. Letters about how much he missed her, how she'd ruined his life by leaving, how he was going to find her and make her come home. After he died, I found boxes of them in the basement, hundreds of pages of the same obsessive thoughts, typed over and over. Why didn't you destroy it?" I tried, but it kept calling to me, like it wanted me to understand David's side of things, like it wanted me to contact Helen myself and tell her how much pain she'd caused. "Did you?" Almost. I got as far as dialing her number before I realized what was happening. That's when I put it on Craigslist. We met the next morning at a storage facility on the outskirts of town. Carol had rented a unit specifically for the typewriter. She told me, a place where it could sit with David's obsessions and not infect anyone else. As we locked it away, I asked her the question that had been haunting me. "How many other people do you think have bought it and sold it back?" She looked at me with tired eyes. "You're the 7th. The thought of 6 other people being drawn into David Morrison's twisted psychology, of potentially contacting Helen or other women in similar situations, made me sick. But what made it worse was knowing that someday, the storage unit would be cleaned out. The typewriter would end up in an estate sale or antique shop, waiting for the next person who thought they were just buying a piece of vintage equipment. Someone who had no idea they were purchasing 20 years of obsession, jealousy, and barely contained violence, all waiting to be typed onto fresh sheets of paper by fingers that thought they were their own. 6 months after the mirror incident, I thought I'd learned my lesson about Craigslist purchases. But there's something addictive about finding hidden treasures. and when I saw the vintage radio listed for $35, I couldn't resist. It was a 1940s Philco, the kind with warm wood cabinet and that distinctive Art Deco styling. The seller, Robert, lived in Oakwood, another quiet suburban neighborhood, but this one felt different. Newer, the kind of place where young families moved to escape the city. Robert answered the door immediately, like he'd been waiting by the window. He was maybe 40, wearing a wrinkled polo shirt and jeans that looked like he'd slept in them. His eyes were bloodshot, with dark circles that spoke of too many sleepless nights. "You here for the radio?" he asked before I could introduce myself. The radio sat on his kitchen table, and it was even more beautiful than the photos. The wood was rich mahogany, polished to a deep shine, and all the original knobs and dials were intact. For $35, it was practically theft. "Does it work?" I asked, running my hand along the smooth cabinet. Robert's jaw tightened. "Oh, it works. Works too well, if you ask me." He paused, then shook his head. "I mean, yeah, it picks up stations fine. AM and FM both." Something in his tone made me look closer. His hands were shaking slightly, and he kept glancing at the radio like it might suddenly spring to life. "Why are you selling it?" "Moving," he said quickly. "Downsizing. Can't take everything." But I noticed the rest of his house was fully furnished. Family photos on the mantle, kids' toys scattered around, a woman's sweater draped over a chair. Nobody was moving. I should have walked away. But the radio was gorgeous, and $35 was nothing for a piece like that. I paid him in cash, and he practically shoved it into my arms. "Listen," he said, as I headed for the door. "If you ever want to sell it back, just call me. I'll pay double what you paid." "Why would I want to sell it?" He stared at me for a long moment. "You'll know." The radio looked perfect on my bookshelf, right between my collection of classic novels and a small succulent my sister had given me. That first evening, I tuned it to a jazz station and let the smooth music fill my apartment while I cooked dinner. The sound quality was incredible, rich and warm in a way that modern electronics can't replicate. But late that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something that made me pause. Voices, faint but distinct, coming from the radio even though I'd turned it off hours ago. I walked over and checked the power switch. It was definitely off, but the voices continued, a man and woman having what sounded like an argument. The words were too muffled to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger, frustration, the kind of heated exchange that happens behind closed doors. I unplugged it completely, and the voices stopped. The next night it happened again. This time I could make out fragments. "Told you not to, ... double quotes, and can't keep doing this, ... double quotes, and the children will hear." I started paying closer attention to the voices, and over the next few days, a disturbing pattern emerged. They were always the same to people, the man and woman, and their arguments were getting more intense, more personal, more violent. By the end of the week I could hear them clearly, even with the radio unplugged. They fought about money, about affairs, about whose fault it was that their marriage was falling apart. And always, there was the underlying threat of violence. The woman's voice grew more frightened each night. The man's grew more aggressive. I tried researching the radio online, looking for any information about its history. What I found made my blood run cold. The original owner had been a family named Harrison, James and Linda Harrison, with 2 young children. In 1952, James had killed Linda with a kitchen knife during a domestic dispute. Then he'd turned the knife on himself. The children had been found 3 days later by neighbors, alive but traumatized beyond repair. The radio had been sold with the rest of the estate. I should have gotten rid of it immediately. But there was something compelling about those voices, something that kept me coming back night after night to listen. It was like eavesdropping on the most intimate, terrible moments of someone's life, and I couldn't look away. The voices were getting stronger, clearer, and they were getting closer to something final. On Thursday night, I heard Linda pleading, "Please, James, think about the children. They're sleeping upstairs. They'll be better off without you," James replied, his voice cold and flat. I heard footsteps, a drawer opening, the distinctive sound of metal sliding against metal, then screaming. I yanked the radio's plug from the wall, but the voices continued. Linda's terrified cries, James's heavy breathing, the wet sound of something I didn't want to imagine, and underneath it all, faintly, the sound of children crying upstairs. The next morning, I called Robert. "I want to sell the radio back," I said. There was a long pause. "What did you hear?" "You know what I heard. Meet me at the Denny's on 5th Street in an hour. Bring it with you." When I arrived, Robert was already there, sitting in a corner booth with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. How long did you have it? I asked, setting the radio on the table between us. 3 months. 3 months of listening to that family destroy each other, night after night. Do you know what the worst part is? I shook my head. You start to root for him. After weeks of hearing her voice, her constant nagging, her threats to leave, you start to understand why he did it. He slid an envelope across the table. $70, as promised. Where are you taking it? I asked. Back where it belongs. The Harrison house is still standing, about 10 miles outside town. Empty now, has been for decades. Maybe they'll finally have some peace. As I watched him carry the radio to his car, I felt the same mixture of relief and guilt I'd experienced with the mirror, because I knew that somewhere, someone else would eventually find that radio. Maybe in an estate sale, maybe in an antique shop, maybe on Craigslist, and they'd take it home thinking they'd found a beautiful piece of history. They'd have no idea they were bringing a tragedy into their lives, night after night, until the voices drove them to understand that some stories never end, they just find new people to tell them to.